On October 15, 2009, the United States witnessed one of the most surreal media spectacles of the early 21st century. What began as a frantic emergency call from a suburban home in Fort Collins, Colorado, rapidly escalated into a nationwide drama involving law enforcement, federal agencies, non-stop live television coverage, and millions of emotionally invested viewers. At the center of this storm was a homemade helium balloon, shaped like a flying saucer, and a 6-year-old boy allegedly trapped inside it. By the end of the day, the story collapsed into humiliation, criminal charges, and the lasting stain on modern journalism. This is the full story of the Balloon Boy hoax, told without sentimentality, without excuses, and without mercy. The central figure of the story was Richard Heen, a man who styled himself as an inventor, storm chaser, and visionary. Heen was not an anonymous suburban father accidentally thrust into the spotlight. He was a man actively chasing it. Years before the Balloon Boy incident, Heen had appeared on the reality television show Wife Swap, where his erratic behavior and grandiose self-image had already raised eyebrows. He was obsessed with gaining recognition, convinced that his ideas were revolutionary, and that mainstream society had failed to appreciate his brilliance. Richard Heen lived with his wife, Mayumi Heen, and their 3 young sons. The family dynamic was unusual. Mayumi, originally from Japan, often appeared withdrawn and submissive, while Richard dominated conversations and decision-making. Their children were regularly exposed to cameras, rehearsed lines, and performative behavior. This was not a household where privacy or normal childhood boundaries were treated as sacred. Attention was currency, and the children were part of the transaction. In the months leading up to October 2009, Richard Heen had been actively pitching reality television concepts to producers. His central idea revolved around science experiments, homemade inventions, and extreme demonstrations designed to captivate audiences. None of these pitches had succeeded. Rejection accumulated, frustration grew, and desperation quietly but decisively took root. The balloon itself was not a spur-of-the-moment creation. It was a carefully constructed object, a large, silver, helium-filled structure resembling a UFO, built from plastic sheets, duct tape, and aluminum framing. Heen claimed it was part of an experimental aircraft project. In reality, it was also a perfect visual prop, strange, dramatic, and irresistible to television cameras. On the morning of October 15, Heen called emergency services and reported that his balloon had accidentally broken free from its moorings and that his 6-year-old son, Falcon, was inside it. The claim was catastrophic by design. A runaway aircraft carrying a child is the perfect storm of fear, urgency, and moral outrage. Authorities had no choice but to respond as if the threat were real. Within minutes, local police and fire departments were mobilized. Soon after, the Federal Aviation Administration became involved, concerned about the risk to air traffic. Television news helicopters, already equipped to chase dramatic visuals, took to the skies. The balloon was spotted floating thousands of feet above the ground, drifting unpredictably with the wind. Live coverage began almost immediately. Viewers across the country watched as the silver balloon moved silently through the sky. News anchors speculated about Falcon's condition. Aviation experts discussed oxygen deprivation. Psychologists weighed in on trauma. No one paused the broadcast to verify the most basic fact: whether the balloon could physically carry the weight of a child in the first place. For over 2 hours, the spectacle continued. Parents hugged their children. Social media, still in an earlier stage than today but already powerful, amplified the panic. The narrative hardened into certainty. A helpless child was trapped inside a fragile object, and time was running out. Then the balloon landed. It touched down in a field approximately 50 miles away from the Heen home. Emergency crews rushed forward. Cameras zoomed in. The hatch was opened. The basket was empty. Confusion rippled through the scene. Had the child fallen out midair? Had he jumped? Was he dead somewhere in a field miles away? The emotional tone of the coverage shifted instantly from hope to dread. What had been framed as a rescue story now threatened to become a fatal tragedy. Authorities launched a massive ground search. Meanwhile, suspicion began to creep into the narrative. The Heen family's explanations were inconsistent. Richard claimed Falcon must have climbed out before the balloon took off. This contradicted his initial emergency call. His body language during interviews appeared strangely performative rather than distraught. Hours later, the truth surfaced not through advanced investigative work, but through the most mundane oversight imaginable. Falcon Heen was found hiding in the attic of the family's home. He was safe. He was calm. He did not appear traumatized. The story officially shifted from disaster to mystery. The final collapse came during a live television interview later that evening. When asked why he had hidden, Falcon casually responded that his parents had told him to do so for the show. The statement was unguarded, innocent, and devastating. In a single sentence, the entire narrative imploded. Law enforcement reopened the case, this time treating it as a potential hoax. Investigators examined phone records, past media appearances, and the family's recent attempts to secure television deals. The pattern was unmistakable. The event had not been an accident, it had been staged. Richard Heen initially denied wrongdoing, insisting the situation had been a misunderstanding. But evidence accumulated rapidly. The balloon had been designed without sufficient lift to carry a child. The timeline of events contradicted his statements. Witnesses reported rehearsed behavior. Eventually, the weight of the facts became impossible to ignore. In November 2009, both Richard and Mayumi Heen pleaded guilty to charges related to false reporting and conspiracy. Richard was sentenced to 90 days in jail. Mayumi received a lesser sentence. The family was ordered to pay more than $36,000 in restitution to cover the costs of emergency response services. Public reaction was brutal and justified. The Heens were not seen as misguided pranksters, but as parents who had exploited public fear and endangered their children for personal gain. Their credibility evaporated. Their media aspirations died instantly. Any remaining sympathy was annihilated by their refusal to fully accept responsibility. Yet the Balloon Boy incident was not merely a story about one dysfunctional family. It was also an indictment of the modern media ecosystem. News organizations abandoned verification in favor of immediacy. Emotional storytelling replaced factual scrutiny. The spectacle was allowed to run unchecked because it generated ratings. Journalism schools later adopted the Balloon Boy case as a cautionary tale. It demonstrated how easily narratives can override logic when fear and visual drama are involved. The question of whether a homemade balloon could realistically lift a child should have been asked within minutes. Instead, it was ignored for hours. The public, too, played a role. Millions accepted the story without skepticism, sharing clips and commentary driven by emotion rather than reason. The event exposed a cultural vulnerability, a willingness to suspend critical thinking in exchange for collective drama. Years later, Richard Heen attempted to rehabilitate his image, claiming he had been unfairly portrayed and that the hoax had spiraled out of his control. Few were convinced. Trust, once broken at that scale, does not regenerate. His name became shorthand for deception, narcissism, and failure. The Balloon Boy hoax endures because it sits at the intersection of multiple modern pathologies: media addiction, performative parenting, reality television culture, and the monetization of attention. It was not an anomaly, it was a preview. In the end, no one emerged as a hero. The child was not rescued because he was never in danger. The parents were exposed as manipulators, the media was revealed as reckless. And the audience was reminded briefly, uncomfortably, that outrage and empathy are tools easily weaponized. The Balloon Boy incident was not about a boy in a balloon. It was about adults who mistook attention for value, institutions that confused speed with truth, and a society that willingly looked away from skepticism as long as the story was entertaining. That is why it still matters. And that is why it still deserves to be remembered not as a quirky footnote, but as a full-scale failure of judgment, ethics, and restraint.